traffic. Tuesday morning and I'm driving the Cybertruck through Manhattan traffic thinking about how driving reveals the true nature of human intelligence and why democracy is fundamentally impossible when the average person has an IQ of 95 and the emotional regulation capacity of a brain-damaged chimpanzee. The streets are clogged with Honda Civics and Toyota Corollas driven by people who probably make less in a year than I spend on supplements. And they're all driving like they have somewhere important to be when the statistical reality is that 90% of them are heading to meaningless jobs where they perform repetitive tasks that could be automated by existing technology if their employers weren't required to maintain employment levels for political reasons. I'm listening to a podcast about emerging markets cryptocurrency regulations while simultaneously monitoring my portfolio performance on 3 different apps and executing small trades during red lights, which is the kind of multitasking optimization that separates successful people from the masses who can barely handle operating a motor vehicle without causing accidents every few miles. The podcast host is explaining how regulatory arbitrage creates opportunities for sophisticated investors to generate returns that aren't available to retail participants who lack the technical knowledge and capital requirements to access offshore derivative markets. My morning routine was perfect today. 4 hours and 17 minutes of optimized sleep followed by cryotherapy, meditation, supplement stack, and 45 minutes of high-intensity interval training that burned exactly 849 calories according to my heart rate monitor and metabolic tracking system. My testosterone levels are at 950/DL, which is higher than 98% of men my age, and my body fat percentage is 7.2%, which I maintain through pharmaceutical-grade peptides and growth hormone that I source from a connection at Mount Sinai who diverts medical supplies from their anti-aging research program. The traffic light turns green and the fucking moron in the Nissan Altima ahead of me doesn't move for 3 full seconds because he's probably texting or checking social media instead of paying attention to traffic signals. This is exactly the kind of inconsiderate behavior that demonstrates why most people don't deserve the privileges they take for granted. Operating a motor vehicle requires constant attention and quick decision-making, but the average driver treats it like a leisure activity where they can multitask and ignore their responsibilities to other road users. I tap my horn lightly to indicate that the light has changed, which is a perfectly reasonable communication strategy that any competent driver would understand and respond to appropriately. Instead, the subhuman in the Altima turns around and gives me the finger like I'm the problem in this situation. This is typical lower-class behavioral patterns where people respond to reasonable requests with hostility and aggression because they lack the cognitive capacity to understand cause and effect relationships or the emotional maturity to accept responsibility for their own actions. The Altima finally moves forward at approximately 15 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, which means this worthless piece of shit is deliberately impeding traffic flow either because he's too stupid to understand optimal driving speeds or because he's passive-aggressively punishing other drivers for his own inadequacies. Either way, he's wasting the time and resources of everyone behind him, which represents a negative externality that reduces overall social efficiency and economic productivity. I change lanes to pass him, and as I pull alongside his vehicle I can see that he's a middle-aged Hispanic man wearing a Yankees cap and talking on his phone while driving, which explains the slow reaction time and poor situational awareness. He's probably heading to some construction job or landscaping work where he'll spend 8 hours performing manual labor that generates minimal economic value while consuming social services that are funded by taxes paid by people like me who actually contribute to technological advancement and capital formation. This is what happens when you allow unlimited immigration from countries with average IQs below 85. You import massive populations of people who lack the cognitive capacity to function effectively in a technologically advanced society, but who still expect access to the same infrastructure and services that were built by higher IQ populations through centuries of innovation and capital accumulation. They drive slowly, work inefficiently, make poor decisions, and generally drag down the overall performance of every system they participate in. I accelerate past the Altima and merge back into the right lane, but now I'm stuck behind a fucking Toyota Prius that's doing exactly 25 miles per hour in a 35 zone. The Prius represents everything I hate about contemporary consumer culture and environmental virtue signaling. It's an ugly, inefficient vehicle that provides minimal performance while allowing owners to feel morally superior about their carbon footprint, even though the manufacturing process for hybrid vehicles actually generates more environmental damage than conventional cars when you account for battery production and disposal costs. The woman driving the Prius has a coexist bumper sticker and what appears to be a meditation crystal hanging from her rearview mirror, which means she's probably one of those spiritual but not religious types who thinks positive thinking can solve complex social problems while simultaneously supporting policies that make those problems worse. She's driving in the left lane even though she's going slower than traffic, which is both illegal and inconsiderate, but she probably thinks traffic laws don't apply to people with good intentions and progressive political beliefs. I flash my high beams to indicate that she should move to the right lane so faster traffic can pass, which is standard highway etiquette that any competent driver should understand. Instead of moving over, she slows down even more and puts on her hazard lights like she's the victim in this situation. This is exactly the kind of passive-aggressive behavior that women use when they want to punish men for existing while maintaining plausible deniability about their hostile intentions. The psychological profile is completely predictable. Middle-aged white woman with a liberal arts education and progressive political beliefs who works in some pseudo-professional field like social work or non-profit administration where she gets paid to feel good about herself while producing no measurable economic value. She probably lives in Park Slope or Williamsburg and shops at Whole Foods and thinks organic food and yoga classes represent meaningful lifestyle choices that demonstrate her moral superiority to people who prioritize efficiency and results over performative virtue signaling. She's probably divorced or in a sexless marriage with some beta male who lets her make all the household decisions while she slowly destroys his self-esteem through constant criticism and emotional manipulation. Her children, if she has any, are probably being raised to be equally ineffective and self-righteous, which means the next generation would be even more dysfunctional than the current one. Traffic starts moving faster and I'm able to get around the Prius, but now I'm approaching the Holland Tunnel where traffic always backs up because the infrastructure was designed in 1927 and hasn't been meaningfully updated to handle contemporary volume levels. This is what happens when democratic political systems prevent necessary infrastructure investment because voters would rather spend tax money on social programs that buy their support than on capital improvements that would actually enhance economic productivity. The tunnel approach is clogged with delivery trucks and commercial vehicles driven by people who probably don't have valid licenses or insurance but who can't be properly regulated because enforcing immigration and vehicle registration laws would be considered racist by the same progressive activists who complain about traffic congestion and air quality in urban areas. It's a perfect example of how ideological thinking prevents practical solutions to obvious problems. I'm stuck behind a FedEx truck that keeps stopping randomly to make deliveries even though he's blocking traffic flow and creating safety hazards for other drivers. The driver is some overweight black guy who's taking his time with each delivery like he's getting paid by the hour instead of per package, which he probably is because labor unions have negotiated compensation structures that reward time spent rather than productivity achieved. This is exactly why automation is inevitable and necessary. Human workers are inconsistent, inefficient, and motivated by considerations other than optimal performance. They get tired, distracted, emotional, and resentful. They make mistakes, waste time, and create problems that require management oversight and correction. Replace them with algorithmic systems and you get consistent results without the drama and interpersonal complications that make human resources so expensive and unreliable. The FedEx truck finally moves and I accelerate into the tunnel, but now I'm stuck behind some soccer mom in a Range Rover who's driving exactly at the speed limit while talking on her phone and completely ignoring traffic flow around her. The Range Rover probably costs more than most people's annual income, but she's driving it like she's afraid of scratching the paint or getting pulled over for a minor traffic violation. This represents everything wrong with contemporary wealth distribution. People who inherit or marry into money but lack the intelligence and competence to use it effectively. She's driving a vehicle that was designed for performance and capability, but she's too risk-averse and socially conformist to utilize its actual features. She probably bought it because other wealthy women in her social circle drive similar vehicles, not because she needed its specific capabilities for any practical purpose. The Range Rover has private school stickers on the back window, which means she's spending enormous amounts of money to give her children access to educational opportunities they probably don't deserve based on their genetic inheritance from her and whatever beta male she convinced to provide sperm and financial support. Private school tuition that could fund multiple full scholarships for genuinely intelligent students from lower-income backgrounds instead gets wasted on mediocre rich kids who will coast through life on inherited advantages. Her children are probably being raised to believe they're special and deserve success without earning it through actual achievement or competence. They'll go to expensive colleges where they'll study meaningless subjects like art history or gender studies, then graduate with degrees that qualify them for nothing except entry-level positions at non-profit organizations or their parents' companies, or they'll be promoted based on nepotism rather than performance. We emerge from the tunnel into New Jersey traffic, which is somehow even worse than Manhattan because suburban drivers have even less situational awareness and driving competence than urban drivers. They're used to wide lanes and predictable traffic patterns, so when they encounter complex navigation requirements they panic and make terrible decisions that create dangerous conditions for everyone else on the road. I'm now stuck behind a fucking minivan with stick-figure family decals on the back window showing 2 parents, 3 children, a dog, and a cat. The psychological profile writes itself. Suburban middle-class family that thinks their reproductive choices represent some kind of meaningful contribution to society instead of just adding more consumption demand to an already overcrowded planet populated primarily by people who lack the intelligence and resources to solve existing problems. The minivan is doing exactly 30 miles per hour in a 45 zone while the driver, who appears to be another middle-aged white woman, periodically turns around to deal with children in the back seats instead of focusing on operating the vehicle safely. She's creating dangerous conditions for everyone around her because she prioritizes her offspring's immediate comfort over traffic safety and efficiency. This is exactly why people like her shouldn't be allowed to reproduce without passing competency tests that demonstrate minimum levels of intelligence, emotional stability, and resource availability. Instead, the current system rewards irresponsible breeding through tax credits and social services that socialize the costs while privatizing the benefits of poor reproductive decisions. Her children are probably being raised on processed food and digital entertainment that will stunt their intellectual development and create behavioral problems that require pharmaceutical intervention and special education services. They'll grow up to be even more dysfunctional than their parents, which means each generation becomes progressively less capable of maintaining the technological and social systems that previous generations built. The minivan finally exits onto some suburban road and I'm able to accelerate back to normal speeds, but now I'm approaching the area where construction crews are working on infrastructure repairs that should have been completed years ago but keep getting delayed because of budget problems and regulatory complications. The construction zone is managed by union workers who are probably making twice the salary they deserve for work that could be completed more efficiently by private contractors with proper incentive structures. Traffic narrows to a single lane and I'm stuck behind a pickup truck with Trump stickers and Confederate flag decals, which represents a completely different category of human stupidity but equally problematic for optimal traffic flow. The driver is probably some working-class white guy who thinks political loyalty and cultural identity are more important than competence and results, which explains why he's driving a gas-guzzling vehicle that represents poor economic decision-making and environmental irresponsibility. The pickup truck is weaving slightly between lane markers because the driver is probably drinking beer or chewing tobacco while operating the vehicle, which are exactly the kinds of behavioral patterns you'd expect from someone whose cognitive development was stunted by poor nutrition, inadequate education, and exposure to lead paint during childhood. These people vote for politicians who promise to protect their jobs and lifestyle choices without understanding that technological advancement makes their skills obsolete regardless of political preferences. They represent the other side of the demographic problem that makes democracy impossible. While urban liberals vote for policies that sound compassionate but ignore economic realities, rural conservatives vote for policies that protect existing industries and social structures without adapting to changing technological and market conditions. Both groups lack the intellectual capacity to understand complex systems or make rational decisions about resource allocation and social organization. Finally, we're through the construction zone and traffic opens up, but now I'm stuck behind a fucking Honda Accord that's doing exactly 40 miles per hour in a 55 zone. The Honda Accord represents peak mediocrity in automotive choice. It's reliable, efficient, and completely without character or personality. People buy Accords because they want transportation that requires minimal thought or engagement, which perfectly reflects their approach to every other aspect of their lives. The driver appears to be an elderly Asian woman who probably shouldn't have a license anymore because her reaction times and visual acuity have deteriorated to the point where she represents a safety hazard to other road users. But taking away driving privileges from elderly people would be considered age discrimination, so instead we allow them to continue operating vehicles until they cause accidents that injure or kill people who actually contribute to society. This is another example of how political correctness prevents rational solutions to obvious problems. Elderly drivers with diminished capabilities should be required to pass annual competency tests that demonstrate they can still operate vehicles safely. Instead, we pretend that driving is a civil right rather than a privilege that requires ongoing qualification, which means dangerous drivers continue operating vehicles until they cause enough damage to justify intervention. I changed lanes to pass the Honda, but now I'm stuck behind a fucking bus that's stopping every 2 blocks to pick up and discharge passengers who are probably heading to minimum wage jobs or government assistance appointments. Public transportation represents massive subsidies for people who lack the resources to own private vehicles, which means taxpayers like me are forced to fund transportation systems that primarily benefit people who contribute minimal economic value to society. The bus is operated by some union employee who's probably making $60,000 per year plus benefits to drive a predetermined route and interact with the kind of people who rely on public transportation. It's a perfect example of how government employment creates comfortable middle-class jobs for people who would otherwise be working in private sector positions where their productivity would be measured and optimized rather than guaranteed regardless of performance. The passengers boarding the bus represent exactly the demographic patterns you'd expect. Elderly people, single mothers with multiple children, immigrants who probably don't speak English fluently, and various categories of people who've made poor life choices that resulted in economic dependency on systems funded by people who made better choices. They're all moving slowly and inefficiently because they're not paying the true cost of the transportation service they're consuming. Finally, the bus moves and I'm able to accelerate, but now I'm approaching my exit where traffic always backs up because the off-ramp design creates bottlenecks that could be eliminated through better engineering but haven't been fixed because infrastructure improvements require political approval from people who don't understand traffic flow optimization or cost-benefit analysis. I'm stuck in the exit lane behind a Subaru Outback with coexist bumper stickers and what appears to be a rescue dog in the back seat. The psychological profile is completely predictable. Liberal professional woman who thinks adopting shelter animals represents meaningful charitable activity while she supports policies that create the social conditions that result in pet abandonment. She probably works for some nonprofit organization or government agency where she gets paid to feel good about herself while producing no measurable results. The Subaru driver is checking her phone at every opportunity, which means she's probably posting Instagram stories about her commute or texting friends about her weekend plans instead of focusing on traffic conditions. This is exactly the kind of distracted driving behavior that causes accidents and creates delays for everyone else, but she probably thinks her social obligations and emotional needs are more important than traffic safety and efficiency. She's probably single and childless despite being in her 30s, which means she's prioritizing career advancement and personal fulfillment over biological responsibilities and social reproduction. Her genetic lineage will end with her, which might actually be beneficial for overall population quality since she clearly lacks the judgment and priorities necessary for effective child rearing in contemporary social conditions. The light finally turns green and traffic starts moving, but the Subaru driver accelerates slowly and cautiously like she's afraid of using too much gas or creating excessive tire wear. This is exactly the kind of penny-wise, pound-foolish thinking that characterizes people who don't understand opportunity costs or optimal resource allocation. She's saving a few cents on fuel while wasting minutes of time that could be used for productive activities. I'm finally able to exit the highway, but now I'm on surface streets where traffic is controlled by traffic lights that aren't synchronized for optimal flow because municipal traffic engineering is managed by government employees who lack the incentives and expertise to optimize system performance. Instead of smooth traffic flow that maximizes efficiency and minimizes delays, we get stop-and-go patterns that waste fuel, increase emissions, and create frustration for drivers who actually have important places to be. I pull up to a red light behind a fucking Prius again, but this time it's driven by some millennial hipster with a man bun and what appears to be a meditation app playing on his phone. He's probably heading to some coffee shop where he'll spend 4 hours pretending to work on his novel or podcast while consuming overpriced beverages and taking up space that could be used by people who are actually conducting business or meeting productivity targets. The millennial represents everything wrong with his generation. Overconfident despite minimal achievements, convinced that his creative projects and personal interests are more important than economic contribution and social responsibility. He's probably living off his parents' money or some trust fund while pretending to be an independent artist or entrepreneur, which means he's consuming resources that were created by previous generations without producing anything of equivalent value. His creative projects are probably typical millennial narcissism disguised as artistic expression. Autobiographical fiction about his feelings and experiences, podcast discussions about topics he doesn't understand, or some kind of social media presence that generates attention without creating actual value. He thinks being authentic and following his passion are more important than developing competence and contributing to productive economic activity. The light turns green and the Prius accelerates at about half the rate that would be optimal for traffic flow, which means everyone behind him has to wait longer to clear the intersection and proceed to their destinations. This creates cascading delays that affect dozens of other drivers who are probably heading to jobs and appointments that actually matter for economic productivity and social functioning. I'm about to change lanes when some fucking BMW cuts in front of me without signaling, which represents a completely different category of inconsiderate driving behavior. BMW drivers are typically higher-income professionals who think their economic success gives them the right to ignore traffic laws and social conventions that apply to everyone else. They drive aggressively and selfishly because they view other drivers as obstacles rather than participants in a cooperative transportation system. The BMW driver is probably some finance bro or real estate developer who makes decent money but lacks the intelligence and sophistication to understand that true success requires consideration for other people's time and resources. He's cutting through traffic and changing lanes constantly because he thinks aggressive driving will save him a few minutes, when in reality his behavior creates dangerous conditions and increases overall travel time for everyone on the road. This represents the kind of short-term thinking and zero-sum mentality that prevents optimal social coordination. Instead of driving in ways that maximize overall traffic flow and minimize collective delays, he optimizes for his own immediate gratification while externalizing the costs onto other road users. It's exactly the same psychological pattern that creates problems in every other area of social and economic interaction. I'm approaching another red light and I can see that there's some kind of fender bender in the intersection ahead where two drivers have had a minor collision, but instead of clearing the roadway quickly, they're standing around exchanging insurance information and probably arguing about whose fault it was. This is exactly what happens when people prioritize legal liability over practical problem solving and social efficiency. Both vehicles appear to have minimal damage that could be repaired for a few $100s, but now they're blocking traffic for hundreds of other drivers who are losing time and productivity because these two morons can't handle a simple situation competently. They should exchange contact information, take a few photos, and move their vehicles out of traffic flow immediately. Instead, they're treating it like a major crisis that requires extensive documentation and discussion. One of the drivers appears to be a middle-aged black woman who's gesticulating wildly and probably trying to blame the other driver for the accident regardless of the actual facts. The other driver is some young white guy who looks confused and apologetic, which means he's probably accepting responsibility even if the accident wasn't his fault because he's been conditioned to defer to minority victimhood narratives and avoid any appearance of racial insensitivity. This is exactly what happens when social justice ideology interferes with practical problem-solving and objective analysis of cause and effect. Instead of determining fault based on traffic laws and evidence, people make decisions based on identity politics and social hierarchy considerations. The result is that accidents take longer to resolve, insurance costs increase for everyone, and traffic delays multiply because rational decision-making gets subordinated to political correctness. A police officer arrives and starts directing traffic around the accident scene, but he's taking his time and apparently enjoying the opportunity to control traffic flow and demonstrate his authority over civilian drivers. Police officers are basically just another category of government employee who gets paid to create problems rather than solve them, which explains why interactions with law enforcement usually make situations worse rather than better. The cop is probably making $50,000 per year plus benefits to stand in traffic and wave his arms around, when the same traffic management function could be handled more efficiently by automated systems or private security contractors who would have incentives to minimize delays and optimize flow patterns. Instead, we get unionized government employees who treat every situation like an opportunity to justify their existence and demonstrate their importance. Finally, the intersection clears and traffic starts moving again, but now I'm running late for my meeting and my stress levels are elevated because of all the incompetence and inconsideration I've been forced to deal with during what should have been a simple 20-minute drive. This is exactly why I prefer working from home or using helicopter transportation when possible, because surface-level interaction with the general population is psychologically exhausting and completely unproductive. I'm approaching my destination, but now I'm stuck behind a fucking school bus that's stopping to discharge children who are probably heading home to spend the afternoon playing video games and consuming processed food instead of engaging in educational activities or physical exercise that would contribute to their intellectual and physical development. The school bus represents massive public investment in educational systems that produce declining results because they're designed to accommodate the lowest common denominator rather than challenge high-achieving students. The children getting off the bus represent exactly the demographic patterns that explain declining educational performance and social dysfunction. Multiple racial and ethnic groups with different average IQ levels and cultural values, all being forced through standardized curricula that ignore cognitive differences and behavioral patterns. The result is that gifted students get bored and disengaged while struggling students fall further behind, and everyone gets socially promoted regardless of actual learning or competence development. These children are being raised by parents who probably don't understand the importance of intellectual development, delayed gratification, and long-term planning. They'll graduate from high school without the knowledge and skills necessary for productive employment in a technologically advanced economy, but they'll still expect access to middle-class lifestyles and social services that are funded by people who made better educational and career choices. The school bus finally moves and I'm able to reach my destination, but the entire driving experience has reinforced my understanding of why democracy is impossible and why most people don't deserve the privileges they take for granted. Every interaction with other drivers revealed patterns of incompetence, inconsideration, and irresponsibility that would be completely unacceptable in any system that prioritized efficiency and results over political correctness and social harmony. I park the Cybertruck and sit for a moment thinking about how much better society would function if driving privileges were restricted to people who could demonstrate minimum levels of intelligence, competence, and consideration for other road users. Instead, we allow anyone with a pulse to operate vehicles regardless of their cognitive abilities, reaction times, or understanding of traffic laws and social cooperation principles. But suggesting competency requirements for driving privileges would be considered discriminatory and elitist by the same people who complain about traffic congestion, accident rates, and air quality problems that result directly from allowing incompetent people to operate motor vehicles. It's a perfect example of how egalitarian ideology prevents practical solutions to obvious problems. As I walk toward the building where my meeting is scheduled, I think about how the 40-minute drive revealed everything that's wrong with contemporary American society. Incompetent people in positions they don't deserve, making decisions they don't understand, creating problems for everyone else while remaining completely oblivious to their own inadequacies and negative externalities. The road rage I felt during the drive wasn't actually rage. It was rational frustration with systemic dysfunction and individual incompetence that interferes with optimal social coordination and economic productivity. My violent fantasies about eliminating inconsiderate drivers weren't pathological. They were natural responses to antisocial behavior that reduces overall social welfare and wastes resources that could be used more effectively. Maybe someday I'll act on those fantasies. Maybe someday I'll follow one of these incompetent drivers home and show them exactly what happens when their actions have consequences beyond mild inconvenience and traffic delays. Maybe someday I'll demonstrate that social cooperation requires enforcement mechanisms more effective than traffic laws and social conventions. But not today. Today I have more important things to accomplish than educating inferior drivers about the costs of their behavior. Today I have profits to generate and wealth to accumulate and social status to maintain. The inferior drivers can wait their turn.